used to do this thing whenever I heard about eating disorder recovery. I would take the before of the recovery story and make that my goal. And I don't want anyone who hears this to do that, to measure themselves against me at my lowest point to determine if they're sick enough, like I used to do. So I'm letting you know that I won't be saying any numbers such as weights or calories during this talk, and I'm doing that on purpose. I'm doing that because at my lowest point, that is what I'd be looking for in a talk like this, and that's not what we need. That's actually the whole point, is that my weight, the numbers, are not what matters about me at this point in the story. You don't need to know how much I was eating. What you do need to know is I was 15. I was cold all the time, generally miserable and tired. And honestly, I was losing a part of my childhood. So if you can picture it, that was the me that was diagnosed with anorexia and began a partial hospitalization program for treatment just before the start of 10th grade. And what I remember most clearly about that time is the second day of treatment, actually, which was a Tuesday. And what I didn't know was that on Tuesdays we had a challenge. Our challenge was to bake something as a group under the direction of one of the program nutritionists, and then to eat it after lunch. So you can imagine I was pretty surprised to come into the group room and learn that we were going to be making peach cobbler. And the really hard part for me came when it was time to face that peach cobbler on my plate. There were probably 10 other people around the table with me, but I definitely couldn't have told you that. It was like everyone and everything else dropped away, and it was just me and this peach cobbler. And I ate it because I honestly just wanted to get out of that situation that was like a staring contest with my own dessert. But even afterwards, I felt like all that existed was this peach cobbler sitting in my stomach, making my skin crawl. Later in the day, we had time to talk as a group about what we were struggling with. And I remember I was still turning that situation over in my head. I was still thinking, trying to calculate how many calories were in the cobbler, how many grams of fat, how much exercise I needed to do. Just absolutely trapped in this big, dark, swirling, isolating bubble of thoughts. And I remember thinking, I must be the only person this messed up. And then the person next to me spoke up. They said, you know, I just can't stop thinking about how many calories that peach cobbler had. And my bubble popped. Suddenly, the rest of the world rushed back in, and I was surrounded by people who were no longer that different from me. They were having the same thoughts I was. So I started to open up. I described to the group how scared I was to be starting treatment. I was thinking, without an eating disorder as my defining characteristic, what was I? I thought dieting was the only thing I was good at. And I don't know what I was expecting when I shared that with the group. I was not expecting understanding, but that's what I got. Other people had also had those thoughts. And I remember when I was done, somebody else in the group looked at me and they said, you know, I do understand. I've been where you are. I felt that. But at the same time, and they trailed off for a second and just looked at me. And then in the absolute most incredulous tone I have ever heard, They went, "How can you not think you're great?" And I started to laugh, right? But they were dead serious, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And then as I looked around at all of these people who I had just realized had the same big, dark, swirling thought bubbles as me, I could see how it would be the most obvious thing in the world. These people were great and interesting and so much more than their eating disorders, and I wanted better for them. It was like an undeniable law of the universe. It was like gravity. I wanted them to get better so badly. It was like the feeling was something tangible that I could pick up and show you. When you're in the depths of an eating disorder, not a lot of things are certain. You spend a lot of time fighting with your own brain. But this, I had never been more certain of anything. I looked at them and I wanted them to get better. And then I realized they were looking at me the same way. As intensely as I believed they were worthy of happiness and confidence and a healthy relationship with their bodies and with food, they believed the same about me. And I didn't see it for myself yet. I was still a long way away from that. But in that moment, I realized it was possible. And that was just some of the ups and downs of one day of treatment. It wasn't smooth sailing from there by any means. After that revelation, I still worked like crazy and almost gave up multiple times. But what helped was I was in this little world surrounded by people who wanted recovery for me. And I started to want it for myself. Can everyone take a deep breath with me? Maybe roll your shoulders a little bit. I acknowledge that was heavy, and I'm not done. Because that supportive little world I talked about, the reality is we don't live in a world like that one. So when I was discharged, suddenly I was back in the same world that had given me all of these ideas in the first place. I was being inundated with all of these awfully strange messages that for the first time I was seeing them for what they really were. And the way people talked about themselves, I want to give you an analogy. It reminds me of when I have people over. I know my space is generally a bit of a mess, so I try to tidy up before people come over. But then, as soon as they're coming in, I panic. And so I try to set their expectations low, right? And so like, no matter how clean it is, no matter how much I did, I open the door and I go, "So sorry for the mess." And people do it to me too. Like, we have this expectation on us to be unhappy with how we present our house, to criticize it before anyone else can say anything. I think we do that with our bodies. We know logically that people are not going to inspect us for flaws. We still fear it happening. And honestly, of course we do. How could we not when everything we consume tells us that's what's going to happen? And so the more I realized that this state of being wasn't necessary, the more I noticed it everywhere. Every time other girls in the locker room inspected their bodies, it wore on me. Every time somebody humble bragged about a new diet, I could not help but compare my plate to theirs. Every ad that came on TV, every post on social media, every part of this industry built on linking our self-worth to our weight. It was overwhelming, and it was insidious. It targeted people who were vulnerable. who didn't think they were good enough or had enough control over their lives, and it gave us a solution that wasn't really a solution. Just a lot of fake rules and blanket statements constructed about what to do with our bodies. We weren't born with a brain hardwired to associate thinner with better. While many people seem to accept that as the status quo, it's not fact. The more we look, the more I know we will find evidence that this is affecting everyone. I want you to think about the last time you felt guilty about eating. What made you associate guilt with that food? Was it truly based on facts? Or maybe was it something a friend or a family member said? Speaking of friends, how many of them have you seen struggling with the same things, the same mentality? So I want to speak to everyone that I know I've seen struggling. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to start the conversation personally. I honestly just didn't know how. But there is so much more to life than this. You are so much more than your eating disorder or your self-discipline or your ability to diet, even when it seems like the whole world, including your own brain, is screaming at you that that's all that matters. The world isn't built for us to love ourselves. And while we weren't necessarily the ones who built it this way, we can all help out with renovations. Deconstructing these ideas we've been raised with is scary, but necessary and worth it. And I know because I'm here and I'm choosing recovery every day, some days more successfully than others. I want you to join me in whatever capacity you can, even if it's just quietly reminding yourself that your perception of your body's worth isn't necessarily shaped by fact. I want you to think back to the story I told, the most terrifying piece of peach cobbler I'll ever have in my life, but also the realest thing I'll ever feel. And when you find yourself in your own version of that story, pop your own bubble, challenge the status quo, and I'm going to help you get started. I'm going to ask you a question that somebody asked me once that sort of changed my life. And I'm going to need you to continue to ask yourself this question when you need to. How can you not think you're great? Thank you.